Thank you, Dr. Stobie, for the introduction. Good evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It's a great pleasure for me to be here tonight to represent the Vietnamese Canadian Federation and as a participant in the interviews within the Hearts of Freedom project. Now, 44 years ago, in 1979, as my family and I were setting out to leave Vietnam by boat, what worried us the most was whether we would succeed in leaving the country without being arrested by the authorities, because it was probably our fifth or sixth attempt at leaving. And so, such was the uncertainty and the desperation that we felt that we paid little attention to the actual destination. We had a very vague idea it would be the shore of freedom somewhere in Southeast Asia, and also we paid little attention to the potential risks and threats that awaited us at sea. Now, if you ask me about the significance of the Hearts of Freedom project, the first thought that occurs to me would go to those we lost on our journey to freedom. The friends and family, the thousands of compatriots that disappeared into the night and we never heard from them again, and whether they left overland or left by sea. So the Hearts of Freedom project should primarily serve as a reminder and a commemoration monument to those we lost. Now, the mandate of the Vietnamese Canadian Federation is to represent the interests of the largely refugee community, Vietnamese community in Canada. And as such, Hearts of Freedom spoke directly to that core mandate of the Federation. And because it was essential to relay the refugee experience and the resettlement experience to the broader Canadian population, as well as to the upcoming generations within the community. And so it spoke to the core mandate and so we were among the key partners that were involved from the beginning of Hearts of Freedom in 2015, along with the Laotian community and the Cambodian community. One of the things that, so basically Hearts of Freedom encompasses a range of perspectives. Obviously, the refugee experience was a Vietnamese experience, a Laotian experience, and a Cambodian experience, but it was also a profoundly Canadian experience because of the unprecedented grassroots response from across Canada and the extraordinary response from within different levels of the Canadian government. So Hearts of Freedom captured all of those perspectives. Now, one dimension I'd like to draw attention to is, and this you would notice if you listen to the interviews or you watch interviews of the refugees within the Hearts of Freedom project. And what they tell you are stories of incredible loss, stories of sacrifice, stories of suffering, stories of separation. And those amounted to stories of trauma. And what do you do when you have gone through a trauma? You have no choice but to try and deal with that trauma and cope with it. And what Hearts of Freedom did was to give the opportunities to the refugees to work through that trauma, to talk about the trauma, and eventually overcome the trauma and find meaning and closure. So even if you were not among the actual interviewees within the project, but if you were a refugee watching the interview, you could benefit vicariously from that project, in the sense that you could also yourself work through your own past ordeals and find meaning and closure to those ordeals. And in that sense, any refugee from any part of the world, be it Ukraine, be it Afghanistan, be it Syria, any refugee watching these interviews would be able to relate and would be able to work through their ordeals and come to some measure of closure. Now, when you talk about the refugee crisis, it's important to talk about the reason why these people left their home countries. And again, I would credit the project team of Hearts of Freedom for using the oral history approach to get direct first-hand accounts from the refugees. Because if you listen to them, what they tell you in the interviews is that they did not leave because of the war, but because of the aftermath of the war, because of the political repression that occurred following the war. It was political persecution, human rights abuses. And so Hearts of Freedom basically set the record straight in terms of a misconception that these were war refugees. They were actually political refugees. And so that's another merit of this particular Hearts of Freedom project. Now, one particular point I'd like to draw your attention to is that those human rights abuses, to a large extent, have continued to this day. And so the Vietnamese Canadian Federation continues to denounce those human rights abuses until those are resolved, or until, well, as long as it is necessary to do so. And so this is something that isn't easily relegated to the past. It's not a project dealing with just past experience, but this is something that is still going on in Southeast Asia. Now I'd like to finish on a somewhat lighter note. I would take you back to my experience leaving Vietnam in 1979. This was from a particular province in the Mekong Delta in southern Vietnam. And we left, obviously, by boat, on a boat, and it had a registration number, as any other boat, registration number that was painted on its side. And you know what the number was? It was 222, so 222. And as I came here today, I was thinking of today's date, which is February 22nd. And I thought it was an interesting coincidence that we would be having this discussion today on this particular date, which goes to show that fate has a way of telling you cannot escape its grips no matter what you try. Thank you very much and have a pleasant evening.